Does She-Hulk hate men? We're nearing the end of the show's run, and if you've spent much time on YouTube in the past few weeks, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this is the question on everyone's lips. But I'm gonna blow your mind a little bit. She-Hulk doesn't hate men, and it isn't woke toxic feminism either, and all the videos and posts you've seen claiming otherwise are kinda silly. This video then is all about why these criticisms, and indeed some other ones as well, are not great, as well as what She-Hulk is actually saying. While, as usual, there was a good deal of anti-woke fluffing going on before the show even aired, the She-Hulk hates men narrative got going in earnest when the first episode dropped, and told a story which included some positive female figures and some negative male ones. No, I'm not joking, that's really what kicked this whole mess off.
The first episode of She-Hulk showed me that men were incompetent within 2 minutes of airing.
You win the case. And you are not helpful here.
It's not really a surprise that this got turned into She-Hulk thinks woman good, men bad, because reactionary internet media discussion often seems woefully unable to interpret texts beyond this sort of brain-dead symbology, but it is still disappointing. Here's a few reasons why this is nuts, though. First, there aren't just bad men and good women in this first episode. Our protagonist is a good woman, sure, but that's kind of inescapable when it comes to adapting She-Hulk. What about Nikki? Well, I don't think we can really begrudge She-Hulk a second prominent non-evil woman. Obviously, it's not unrealistic either. A lot of women have female best friends, and the legal comedy side of the show was always going to feature prominently more members of Jen's team. Nikki being Jen's paralegal is a good way to tie Jen's personal and professional worlds together. And the other major woman who appeared in episode 1? Oh right, Titania, one of the show's main villains. I mean, we didn't know the specifics of her villainy until after episode 1 dropped, but that speaks more to how obscenely premature this whole backlash was than to any of the issues in the show itself. Men bad though, I hear you say, because there's an annoying lawyer, and because there's some tension between Jen and Bruce, or He-Hulk, if you will. But, like, Bruce isn't bad, he's a hero, he's a good guy, we know this. And he's not even really an antagonist in this episode, he's just in opposition to Jen for some of it because he doesn't realize that not all Hulks have the same process and issues. This creates drama, because stories need conflict, but that doesn't make him some woke liberal writer's sock puppet version of a man-spreading idiot male. It makes him a character. What about the scene outside the bar, though? Surely that's Disney attacking its male fans? Well, no, obviously. Not most of them, at least. Because if you watch a sequence where a bunch of dudes gang up on a woman on her own, ignore the fact that she wants nothing to do with them, and generally act in a predatory manner, and you feel personally victimized by the show not framing them in a positive way, then you're just kind of telling on yourself at this point. I've seen people calling it an unnecessary scene too, an unrealistic political soapbox moment, but it isn't unnecessary, and it isn't unrealistic. She-Hulk is interested in the female experience, the way anger and vulnerability intersect. That's not incidental to the show, that is the show, at least in part, and we'll talk more about the specifics of this later, but as for it being unrealistic and shoehorned in, I am sorry to be the one to break this to you, but Marvel didn't invent this dynamic of harassment to push its woke agenda. You'd be hard-pressed to find a woman Jen's age that hasn't experienced harassment, or casual workplace misogyny for that matter, or, conversely, experienced unexpected acts of kindness or solidarity from other women. And hey, that's not exclusive to women, but She-Hulk never claims it is. And maybe the bathroom sequence is a bit exaggerated, but that's kind of the identity of this show. It's more stylized, more heightened reality than a lot of the Earth-based MCU stuff has been, and integrating its exploration of femininity into this style seems pretty clearly to be the point here. If it hadn't done this, if the style of the show had screeched to a halt to deliver a similar beat in a raw, real way, there'd have been just as much backlash, if not more, for being preachy, pandering to the woke liberals with a very special episode, that kind of thing. If you don't believe me, hey, remember, the episode actually did something kind of like this, or at least something which was widely perceived as this, about 10 minutes later, later, and everyone lost their damn minds. But don't worry, we will be returning to that moment later in the video. And of course, we've only been talking about episode 1. The men bad, women good paradigm falls apart even more if you watch more than the first 30 minutes of the show. There are more examples of bad women. Lulu, for instance, is like the worst, and every time Titania pops up again, it becomes even clearer how much of a rotten egg she is. There's also plenty of fine, even good male characters. Luke, Jed, Pug, who I love, by the way, and oh yeah, Daredevil's showing up. Daredevil. We like Daredevil, don't we? And don't forget about all those absolute kings from Abomination's Ranch. I'm sure someone somewhere is about to say, well, actually, no, I shouldn't have, waited and not jumped to conclusions because the first episode was a mission statement for the show. And, no, but also no, because episode 1 wasn't even episode 1 until kind of late into the show's development. The origin stuff shot for this episode was originally in episode 8, the penultimate installment in the show's first season, so it's pretty clear that no, this wasn't meant to be some grand opening statement about the evils of the masculine. So I hope you can see that this complaint doesn't really work on any level, and that it really just boils down to fragile male viewers being fundamentally uncomfortable watching a more female-centric show, especially one which doesn't ignore that parts of the female experience do kind of suck. She-Hulk, then, doesn't hate men, and the common arguments for why it does don't hold up super well. But, toxic femininity, liberal woke feminist Hollywood can't write protagonists? Mary Sue? That, of course, is the next accusation, and if it sounds garbled and nonsensical, then good, because that means I've represented it accurately. The thing is, I can't exactly set out the points of this argument and then counter them systematically because there's no stable, specific critique here. A lot of people like to throw these buzzwords out there as they rail against this property or that, but they use them in different arguments and indeed to signify different things. So the best I can do here is pick a specific popular example, and I decided to go with this video by Sydney Watson. It's a discussion of feminist Hollywood, released shortly after She-Hulk dropped, largely framed around the show. It's got over 1 million views, and for some baffling reason, it's been in my recommended for weeks now. Surprisingly, it doesn't offer a particularly strong critique of She-Hulk, or toxic feminism, and there's a moment near the video start which sums up the wider failure of a lot of this discourse.
So the male superheroes don't have any time for women because they're busy saving the world. But the female superhero is not interested in saving the world and is instead interested only in her career and dating life. Do you see? Do you see the problem?
I don't see the problem, because Jen is a person first, and a woman superhero second. This speaks to a general failure in responses like this, where vitriolic criticism is facilitated by the treatment of a character solely as a type. In this argument, Jennifer Walters isn't Jennifer Walters, a motivated self-starter who loves her job, her friends, her family, who likes to drink and dance, who stans Megan Thee Stallion, who has a life and a mindset that's unique to her. No, in this argument, she's boiled down to a blank-faced representative for the abstract concept of women and women superheroes. Every act of hers, every viewpoint, every decision she makes, these are no longer understood in relation to her characterization and background, but in relation to her type. Woman superhero. Jennifer Walters is understood as little more than a marionette, her actions determined by the woke corporate politicking of Disney. When you dispense with this mindset, the problem goes away, because Jennifer Walters is a character unto herself. Ignoring this, the fact that Jen is a character with motivations and a personality that maybe impact why She-Hulk isn't a story about saving the world is wild. Jen's one of the first properly reluctant superheroes we've seen in the MCU, and at this point in the show, she isn't even a superhero. She's a person with superpowers. Reducing Jen to just a woman archetypically, eliding that difference to make some harebrained point about the woke feminist agenda is dumb and regressive.
Whether you've seen it or not, you're probably all aware at this stage that She-Hulk is yet another bizarre attempt to shove corporate feminism down everybody's throats.
We'll return to the idea of corporate feminism, the girl boss factor of She-Hulk later, but it's weird how Sydney doesn't see that reductionism is the problem here, especially since she says this later in the video.
Writers focus more attention on the sex, skin color, or sexual orientation of a character, rather than than making that character into a multifaceted individual, it's ultimately unwatchable.
If any of this feels familiar, that's probably because what Sydney's done here is pretty much the same flawed approach taken by the She-Hulk hates men crowd. That is, one aspect of the text is isolated, taken out of context, held up as proof that the mere presence or depiction of something within the text straightforwardly reflects the text's, and indeed the creator's, agenda. It shows men acting bad. She-Hulk hates men. It features a protagonist more interested in her own life than joining some superhero squad. Disney and Hollywood are shoving corporate feminism down our throats. A lot of Sydney's subsequent points are, let's say, shaky, based on conjecture rather than anything resembling evidence.
Despite what feminist Hollywood might have you believe, these films, shows, and franchises are not appealing to men.
Hey, I'm a man, this appeals to me.
But they're also not appealing to women. Seriously, I don't know a single woman who actually enjoys this.
Cool, I know women who this does appeal to. The piece is broadly pretty low quality, opening with a rebuttal which displays Sydney either hasn't seen or misremembers entirely some of the projects she's discussing.
I came across an article about She-Hulk. It explains that while Marvel films lack humanistic character traits such as sex, despite Iron Man being a womanizing millionaire and Thor being a god surrounded by a sea of women,
Iron Man, of course, has only been portrayed as a womanizer for like the first half or so of his first film, and in a brief flashback during Iron Man 3. That's part of 2 out of, what, like 9 cinematic appearances? The rest of the time he's in a committed monogamous relationship, one which never really goes beyond hand-holding and the odd kiss on screen. Similarly, Thor's arc in the MCU is anything but raunchy. I guess he kisses a random girl in a 3-second flashback in Love and Thunder's opening montage. Apart from that, when it comes to Thor's womanizing, he's the guy pining over his star-crossed soulmate. I don't want to get into that whole sexless MCU debate, because that's another thing entirely, but this false start really sets the tone for the rest of Sydney's video. The other points on She-Hulk's toxic feminism include dismissing harassment as trivial nonsense.
The point is, unlike She-Hulk, Banner is not dealing with some trivial nonsense where someone calls out to him in the street to say he looks nice.
And a section where Sydney kinda argues that the traits of feminist characters like Jen are just the traits of male villains, and that this constitutes poor and sexist writing. But the only example she really gives is emotionlessness in She-Hulk, and I'm not totally sure what show she's been watching, because clearly it's not the same one I have, and did I miss some big cultural reset where every villainous male character suddenly became emotionless? There's even one point which sees Sydney use She-Hulk as an example of the shallow characterization which inevitably follows female characters being shoved into shows for no good reason.
And because these female characters are often shoved into a movie or a show for no good reason,
being only there, of course, for woke agenda-related reasons.
They are there for the express purpose of propagating a feminist message. And when they do, for some reason, have a struggle, it's as one-dimensional and flat as this.
Well, here's the thing, Bruce. I'm great at controlling my anger. I do it all the time. When I'm catcalled in the street.
And okay, 2 things here. That example isn't really a struggle, it's the explanation the show gives us for Jen's lack of this particular struggle. And second, how is She-Hulk herself shoved into She-Hulk? What the rest of the video pulls back to a wider, more abstract argument, including of course the requisite Brie Larson bashing, against some imagined feminist Hollywood, so we'll leave Sydney here, but in summary, She-Hulk is toxic because she has a life and she's an emotionless, male villain-like woman. Could have fooled me, Marvel. You were the sweetest thing. This section of my video on toxic feminism was originally going to see me go over and debunk more examples than just this one, the first one I decided to watch, but god damn did I take a lot of psychic damage watching this one, and I don't think I've got it in me to do another right now. I could do a couple more in another standalone video, so let me know if that's something you guys would be into. Regardless, a lot of the points Sydney made, particularly that first one, have some crossover with the wider discussion around She-Hulk and toxic femininity. And as with the She-Hulk hates men nonsense, this stuff falls apart like slow-cooked pork under even a little scrutiny. But if it's all so dumb, why are so many people saying it? Why are so many people listening? The answer, as it turns out, is fairly straightforward: money. This anti-woke, anti-SJW internet space has been doing this for years now, churning out broadly similar content, repeating the same inflammatory narratives to a continuous, ever-growing pool of viewers, pressure cooking their brains until they develop a Pavlovian response to the same handful of buzzwords and subjects. See, get wound up, click, like, comment, share, rinse and repeat. All of this, of course, is great for the creators, analytically speaking. Cultivating so reliably an intense emotional response means these viewers are more likely to insta-click on these rage-bait thumbnails, more likely also to watch the whole thing, and the likes and enraged essays of agreement they comment down below, that feeds these videos' engagement statistics. These three things together, click-through rate, watch time, and engagement, are like the YouTube secret sauce. If you satisfy all of these consistently, your videos almost certainly find algorithmic success. That means new viewers, the audience grows, and the next video gets an even better response. And this is very lucrative. Take that video on She-Hulk and toxic feminist Hollywood from Sydney Watson. That's on over 1.1 million views as I write this video, and to just ballpark how much she's made from that using data from my own channel, from videos of a similar length, I'd say around $4,500 from YouTube AdSense alone. And I say alone because this video was sponsored by established titles. Unless she got a pretty raw deal from the sponsor, I'd ballpark that the absolute lowest that sponsorship is likely to have cost is, say, another $3,000, and it was probably a good deal more. The other key here is that so many channels have realized this, and have also realized that they stand to benefit immensely more if they all do this together. The same buzzwords, the same topics, the same shows railed against across all of these channels, that makes it so much easier to speedrun the viewer indoctrination process, because an algorithmic pipeline is created. When you've watched your first one, you start getting recommended other similar videos by similar channels, and when you've clicked your second, this effect scales up, and on and on. Fast forward a few weeks, and most of the discussion you're seeing for new projects is this discussion, and ever so slowly you start to just assume that if so many people are saying these things so consistently, and if you're not seeing any good counterpoints because the algorithm isn't showing them to you, then they must be right. You start to believe, so you start to get more devoted to the fictions these channels spin, and you get more and more emotionally invested in coming back again and again. This is also why people jumped in with all that why She-Hulk is badly written mumbo-jumbo immediately after episode 1 dropped, to coast on the massively popular culture of negativity developed by more explicitly reactionary content creators, without necessarily having to come out explicitly in support of their more dicey alt-right derived talking points and dog whistles. And I'm not just pulling this out of my arse. Some of the smaller creators of videos like this are outright admitting they're just trying to jump on the rage-driven algorithm. Oh, and this part of the video right here, I originally had a section here about the critical drinkers nonsense video on the She-Hulk premiere, but it got so large I had to cut it out and release it as a standalone, which should be out already. Maybe it's even linked up in the corner of the screen right now, so maybe check that out if you haven't. And if you have seen that one, just like mentally stitch it in here. And stuff like this, if we're being generous, we could call premature, but if we're not, we could call it opportunistic tailcoat riding, benefiting from the hate pipeline created by obviously reactionary content without seeming to be a part of it. But yeah, channels like these drop scathing hit pieces about the writing and ideology of projects like this after one episode has released, and that's your clue that they're not actually interested in analysis, in criticism for its own sake, because if they were, they'd wait to see more than just the beginning of the story before they called the writing and the show across the board bad. Because hyper-focusing in on a single episode of a TV show is all well and good, but treating it as its own discrete text, not also as the beginning, the groundwork, the setup for a larger, intrinsically interconnected body of work, is like trying to enter a Shetland pony into a dog show. Hey, case in point, as I write this sentence, it's the morning of October the 1st, and I've woken up to see Nando v Movies has made a video on She-Hulk. And on the one hand, that means people are definitely gonna see this video and the previous one and think, oh look, Pillar of Garbage is copying Nando, even though I've been working on this for like a week already. But on the other hand, that's great. It shows you the difference between Nando and some of the channels we've just been talking about. He waited for the majority of the show to unfold before coming down with a judgment, before critiquing parts and praising others, instead of jumping to release a half-baked analysis after the story had just started. That tells you he's interested in more than just clicks. He's actually bothered about good faith analysis, and apparently that's rare. Look, the point I'm trying to make here isn't that people can't criticize She-Hulk or new shows more widely. Of course they can. But these channels, which coincidentally tend to be negative about all the same stuff the outright bigots are, and tend to release those negative videos, making far-reaching claims just after a show like She-Hulk has begun to air, that's a fairly good clue that they may not be operating in good faith, and may be, instead, chasing the bag. And you might be wondering why, in a segment ostensibly about why there's so much garbage She-Hulk criticism out there, I've painted a far wider, less specific, more holistic picture of the reactionary creator economy. That's because it isn't about She-Hulk. Just like it wasn't about Ms. Marvel, or Kenobi, or Rings of Power, or The Little Mermaid, or The Woman King. It's about the extremely lucrative persecution narrative of the anti-woke cult, and the way it's ludicrously easy to translate belief in this narrative into money, lots of it, by projecting the same bollocks onto the background of pretty much any new mainstream franchise project. So, She-Hulk isn't saying men are bad, or that women are the best, or that dating is more important than saving the world, or any of the other 1,000 things that a lot of very silly people have accused it of. But in that case, what is it saying? Well, that's what the next part of this video will discuss. I'm going to offer a few points you won't have heard from the clone army of reactionary reviewers, on both individual moments and the show's wider ideas, and I want to start with the scene.
So I'm an expert at controlling my anger because I do it infinitely more than you.
I really don't think there's much of an issue here for two reasons. One, this scene's speaking to the way anger is experienced differently between men and women. In my previous She-Hulk video, the whole critical drinker mess, we talked a little about how the point of this scene seems to be, at least in part, that too few people recognize the way the same things can be experienced in different ways by different genders. Bruce's Hulk experience is different to Jen's, due partially to the different way they experience anger, and if he'd realized this from the start, a lot of this tension could have been avoided. And I want to follow up on that by developing the idea that anger is experienced differently depending on gender, because it isn't made up, it's just a thing. Research has found that women do experience anger as frequently and as intensely as men, but that men are more likely to outwardly display or express that anger. One study of 200 participants determined that while women were angry as much as men and acted on that anger as much as men felt less effective when forced to contain their anger, while women seemed better able to control immediate impulsive responses to anger. The jury's still out as to the precise reasoning for this. There may be some evidence that the brain chemistry of cis women helps with suppressing anger due to their larger orbital frontal cortexes, but researchers agree that even if this is true, there's undoubtedly a social component here too. That is, scientifically speaking, Jen actually isn't making this up. Women at large are better at controlling their anger because things go worse for them if they don't. And maybe a not insignificant part of the frustration here is that this difference, and the literally hundreds of similar ways that women's lives are just slightly different to theirs, often negatively, is invisible to a lot of men. Maybe that's one of the things this scene's saying, and if that's the case, then there's an irony to the way this point itself proved invisible to so many of them. But I can just tell that, like, a bunch of you were itching to make the point that, okay, sure, Jen might have a point about female and male anger more generally, but she's talking to the Hulk, the guy who knows a thing or two about controlling his anger. But, like, does he? I don't know. I think there's a pretty solid argument to be made that the defining characteristic of the Hulk is the way he fails to control his anger. And maybe the MCU version of him is kind of different in this regard, at least in the last decade or so, what with the whole journey toward a more zen disposition, but we do see a few times in this episode, and once or twice in Endgame, that even Smart Hulk has a bit of a short fuse. There were a lot of people saying that Jen claiming to have to manage her own anger more than Bruce was openly nonsensical, but at present, isn't that just accurate? The whole Smart Hulk / Gamma Inhibitor deal means that Bruce doesn't really have to worry about controlling his rage anymore. Before that, he was the Hulk for years, and before that, the Avengers had seemingly set up a pretty solid system for dealing with any normal non-Scarlet Witch-induced Hulk outs. Another point people like to bring up is that Bruce has more more reason to be angry or to have difficulty controlling his emotions because of all that childhood trauma, but to my knowledge, that kind of stuff might just not exist in the past of MCU Bruce. And this isn't necessarily some targeted neutering of the character, it's not even something that's always been a part of comic book Bruce, even in 616, and the MCU's always been a bit erratic when determining what to adapt and what not to. A lot of this channel's regular viewers seem to like the old cartoon Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, so is that a bad adaptation, character assassination, because it doesn't adapt or even reference in kid-friendly ways that Bruce has a particularly traumatic background? I've never heard anyone claim that. More to the point, though, that isn't what Jen's saying here. She isn't saying he's got no reason to ever feel angry, that he has an easy time controlling his anger. The point is more, to borrow a thought from King Canuck, a user on this channel's Discord server, Bruce's anger control was because if he lost it, he'd hurt others. Jen's was because if she lost it, others would hurt her. So she's just saying she's got plenty of experience in it, and that as a woman, there are a lot of everyday situations where she has to keep a lid on her emotions in ways that wouldn't necessarily apply to her if she were a man. And if you don't believe that there's truth to this statement, I don't know, man, maybe just go outside a bit more. But I said 2 reasons why this scene's fine, didn't I? Time for numero dos. I'm struggling to believe that this is a point I have to make again, but there is a difference between a character saying something and the show saying something. The reason this exchange is fine is that Jen's viewpoint is a valid one which fits coming from this character at this point in the story, but it isn't objectively correct, and the show isn't trying to claim otherwise. There is a difference, a pretty big one actually, between an authorial perspective and a character's perspective. Bruce and Jen's Hulk experiences are different. The ways they've existed in our world and experienced shared phenomena like anger are different. But, and the rest of the show bears this out, Bruce's advice here is largely helpful, even if he's not as aware as he could be of these differences and how they play into Jen's process. Because of what Jen's been through, because of her temperament, which we'll flip back to in like a minute, and because Bruce seems to be missing the point, failing to properly account for their differences, Jen flares up. That is a valid response. Given who she is and where she is, it's understandable why she gets annoyed, and as we've explored before, this response has some real truth to it. Also, as we've explored before, it's a relevant moment when considering the show's perspective on the female experience. It's a valid response, but that doesn't make it a correct response. Hey, future pillar of garbage here. I actually finished this whole video before episode 8 came out, but I'm coming back after having watched it, adding this in to say episode 8 demonstrates this just insanely clearly. Both Bruce's advice about accepting her capacity for superheroism, and his point about what happens if you lose control, even for a second, about anger and perception, Jen's dismissal of these is revealed to have been entirely premature, like Dedoy. I'd be fascinated to see how the scene's harshest critics who didn't get this, who didn't get that a character doing something in a show doesn't just magically mean the show endorses that behavior, manage to contort their brains to continue justifying their takes. But yeah, back to the video. Outside of, I don't know, children's books, fiction isn't a question of a protagonist bouncing between black and white situations, acting perfectly and flawlessly resolving their conflicts. It's flawed people existing in complex situations, working toward resolution in imperfect ways. There's not some magical link of endorsement between what a main character does and what the text or the writer thinks is right. She-Hulk is no different here. But maybe you don't like this scene, maybe you think all this could have been made clearer, and fine. From an out-of-universe perspective, the writers could have predicted that this exchange would be misinterpreted, and could have written these lines in a more precise, nuanced, delicate way. But as we see later on in the show, the writers were aware enough of the current pop cultural landscape to know that whatever She-Hulk ended up being, it was going to be used as fuel for the sort of rage-bait profiteering we discussed above. To a point, it doesn't matter about the execution, about how these lines were written, because whichever way these concepts were expressed, the same people would have flipped their shit. But also, you couldn't really change it that much. From an in-universe perspective, Jen's pissed here. She's not gonna be giving a calm, super articulate answer. That wouldn't make sense. And also, more importantly, yeah, Jen comes across a little full of herself. That's one of her character traits. And looking at the show as a whole, rather than isolating the premiere and trying to take it as a standalone text, that's probably a response, a coping mechanism for the self-esteem issues we saw in episodes 6 and 7. That's character. That's complexity. That's the point. And okay, they could have rewritten the whole scene so she wasn't ticked off here, they could have rewritten her whole character to be flawless and zen the whole time, but they shouldn't need to, and that would make for an obscenely boring project. Call me a woke SJW simp cuck if you like, but I don't think the She-Hulk writers' room should have had to self-censor, to mutilate their own work to appease fragile man-children projecting their own issues onto a superhero TV show. To be clear, I'm not talking about you there if you just didn't like the scene or if you think it could have been handled more delicately, that's fine, whatever. But if you've been kicking up a stink about how this scene shows that woke Marvel hates men, etc, etc, or god forbid, if you're one of the people actually making these videos, honestly, just go and buy a book or two on media analysis and give them a read. Look, if you still hate the scene or the show, then at the end of the day, you're free to disregard entirely all of these points and interpretations I've given, but you're not free to disregard the fact that other valid interpretations do exist. And you've also got to accept that a positive female perspective doesn't automatically equate to an anti-male one. It's like telling someone you like dogs doesn't also mean you hate cats. That's a different thing, because the key to understanding this scene, to understanding the whole show in a non-ridiculous way, is actually very simple. All you need to do is accept this, that a show being positive about women doesn't mean it's being negative about men. It's not a zero-sum game. And if it's to be remotely faithful to reality, affirming the aspects of the female identity which don't tend to get the spotlight, especially in projects and genres like this, that's going to include some negativity about some men, some types of men, and the actions some of them take. Just like it's going to include negativity about some women, some types of women, and their actions. And none of this is to say that all media that attempts to place a level of emphasis on female affirmation or empowerment is automatically perfect or beyond reproach. Lindsay Ellis has a typically insightful video talking about the way studios injecting female characters with ill-fitting girl bossery isn't an entirely made-up phenomenon. But that isn't what's happening here. She-Hulk is kind of a girl boss, and she has been for decades. That isn't something woke Disney have added in this adaptation. If you're one of the people whining about this as a change from the comics, you probably haven't actually read many She-Hulk comics. In this case then, this aspect of Jen isn't some artificial foreign character trait that Disney have transplanted onto her, the type of thing Ellis discusses in that video. No, this is a part of She-Hulk, and that is nothing new. Now, the fact that it's faithful doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. The whole girl boss idea, this sort of neoliberal feminism, is riddled with issues. Often unaware as it is that the fundamental hierarchical injustices and exploitation which necessitate feminism are, albeit in different ways, just as intrinsic to capitalism as they are to patriarchy. And look, we'll see how, if at all, She-Hulk approaches these complexities, but if it doesn't manage to reconcile that tension, or at least if it doesn't attempt to, then that's grounds for a critique of this show's feminism. She-Hulk hates men? That isn't. But I want to think back to this idea of spiritual fidelity to the She-Hulk comics, because it guides us nicely into the final point I want to make. Because if we look forward a bit to the more recent episodes and the fairly self-aware way they approach the show's own reception, we see this fidelity in spades. With the whole fake intelligentsia, toxic memes and posts skewing impressively close to the reality, we see a characteristically self-aware move on She-Hulk's part, a recognition of the inevitability of this toxicity. And I love this, not merely because it's funny or because it taps on the fourth wall in the same way that all the best She-Hulk comics do, but because it reclaims its own narrative on a metatextual level, in essentially making the show's own inevitably toxic reception a part of its story. She-Hulk's able to take the power away from the very real chuds and grifters we talked about earlier, and use that power to elevate its story. That's fascinating to me. It's probably the nearest the MCU has ever come to feeling punk. Whatever the gender politics of She-Hulk were, the reaction was always going to be more or less the same. Woke, feminist, SJW, it hates its fans, etc. And orienting Jen's struggle against an in-universe reflection of this toxic fandom culture is a killer move, one that's She-Hulk to a T, and one that's effective enough to cause some of these morons' brains to temporarily shut down. She-Hulk doesn't hate men, or fans, it just mocks toxic wankers. And this part of the show displays that very clearly. It's not beyond criticism, of course. Shit, let's criticize it a bit now. The CGI needed more time. The season's too short for the episodic/serialized blend we've seen so far. Even considering the sitcom genre, the show's too comfortable undercutting sincere moments with humor. That whole Captain America Virgin bit is pretty misjudged. I kinda get what they were going for, but it's generally not a great look, and given the justification the writers have given, comes across borderline aphobic, and it's kind of exhausting that the show's doing another secret villain whose identity we don't know thing after like a lot of those last year. All of those criticisms are valid, and so are plenty of others. But wah, my superhero show hates men just isn't. I'm sorry, it isn't. It doesn't even have a basis, even on the most brain-dead symbolic level, because men and women are both good and both bad plenty in the show, and both get mocked, because it's a comedy, and that's a fairly common thing for comedies to do. At the end of the day though, this is just one quick dip into the endless sludge of really dumb She-Hulk discourse. We've barely broached the topic. If this video does well, maybe I'll dive back into the mire, or maybe I'll take a wander through the similarly toxic cesspools of content around, say, Rings of Power. I don't know, let me know what you'd be into below. And if you want to help restore my sanity after all this nonsense, not many people know this, but each like actually extends the period of time before my mind snaps like a twig. It's this new feature YouTube added, so do with that what you will. And I did just want to raise one more thing. This video isn't sponsored or anything, so in lieu of that, I will just say, if you've been enjoying my content and you're in a financially comfortable position, maybe just give the channel Patreon a look. From just £2 a month, you get access to a whole lot of cool benefits, like exclusive videos and input into which videos I make. I don't normally ask like this, but around the time this video goes live, I'm moving into a new place, and I'm gonna do my absolute best to keep putting out videos at the rate I have been, but the finances of that are gonna be fairly tight. So all the support I can get on a platform like Patreon is really gonna go a long way in determining whether or not I've got a future in full-time content creation. Anyway, thanks for watching. Share this around if you liked it, big up all my current patrons, especially Kevin Douglas, Ian Fifield, and Strangefolk, and with the She-Hulk finale coming up, let's all just be non-toxic and cool and chill and nice from now on, yeah? Bye-bye now.